Whispers from the attic. For as long as I could remember, the old house at the end of Maple Street had always intrigued me. My friends told tales of its haunted past, but I never believed them until the summer I turned 16. It was a sweltering July evening when I decided to explore the house. My heart raced with excitement and a hint of fear as I approached the creaking front door, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. I pushed it open, and the hinges groaned in protest, as if warning me to turn back. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by the fading light. I wandered through the dimly lit rooms, each one telling a story of neglect. In the corner of the parlor, I found an old rocking chair, its paint chipped and faded. As I touched it, the chair creaked eerily, as if someone had just been sitting there. The staircase to the attic loomed ahead, shrouded in darkness. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine, but my curiosity drove me onward. With each step, the wooden stairs groaned beneath my weight, protesting my ascent. When I reached the attic door, it stood slightly ajar, an invitation or a warning. I couldn't tell which. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the cold, musty attic. Dust motes floated in the thin beam of light that slipped through a small cracked window. As I scanned the room, something caught my eye, a large ornate mirror covered with a tattered cloth. My heart raced. I could sense a heavy presence in the room, an almost tangible tension. Compelled by an inexplicable urge, I pulled the cloth away. The mirror revealed not just my reflection, but something darker lurking behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I turned, but there was nothing there, just the emptiness of the attic. I chuckled nervously, brushing off the fear as imagination. But then I heard it, a soft whisper like someone calling my name. Leela. The sound was barely audible, but it sent chills racing through me. I turned around, heart pounding. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Leela. I backed away from the mirror, adrenaline surging. I couldn't explain it, but I felt drawn to the whispers, as if they were pulling me closer. The shadows around me shifted, and I could see shapes moving just at the edges of my vision. I spun around, my pulse racing. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. Silence enveloped me, thick and suffocating. Then, as if in response, the mirror shimmered. I took a step closer, drawn in by an unseen force. My reflection flickered, and for a brief moment, I didn't see myself. Instead, I saw a girl, pale, with hollow eyes and a sorrowful expression. She reached out, her finger brushing against the glass, and I felt a cold wave wash over me. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. My instincts screamed at me to flee, but I was rooted to the spot, caught in her gaze. In that moment, I felt a strange connection, an understanding of her anguish. I didn't know who she was or what had happened to her, but I knew I had to help. "Help you how?" I managed to whisper back, my voice trembling. The mirror shimmered again, revealing flashes of a past I didn't understand. A family torn apart, a tragedy that sealed her fate. "Free me," she pleaded, her voice fading into an echo. Suddenly, the attic grew cold, and I could feel the weight of despair pressing down on me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. "I can't help you," I shouted, panic overtaking me. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The girl's reflection twisted in anguish, her features contorting as the whispers grew frantic. "You must find it," she cried. The locket. Desperate, I searched the attic, throwing aside boxes and old furniture. Dust filled the air, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of cries. I could barely think over the noise, fear constricting my chest. Then, beneath a pile of old clothes, I spotted a glimmer, a small silver locket. I grasped it tightly and turned back to the mirror. The girl's face softened as I held it up. "You found it," she whispered, her voice now soothing. "What do I do?" I asked, breathless. "Place it on the mirror," she instructed, her gaze steady. With trembling hands, I laid the locket against the glass. The mirror rippled like water, and a blinding light erupted from its surface. I shielded my eyes as the girl began to fade, a look of gratitude washing over her face. "Thank you," she breathed, and then she was gone. The attic fell silent, and the air lightened. The mirror reflected only my shocked expression. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over me. I had done it. I had freed her. I stumbled out of the attic, my heart still racing. As I made my way down the stairs, I looked back one last time. The mirror no longer shimmered with shadows, it was just glass, cold and empty. But as I stepped outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forgotten doll. The storm raged outside, thunder rumbling like an angry beast as I rummaged through my grandmother's attic. I was looking for old books, but found an ancient, dusty box instead. Inside lay a porcelain doll, its face cracked, but its glassy blue eyes seemed to twinkle with life. I felt an odd connection to it, as if it were beckoning me to take it home. That night, I placed the doll on my nightstand, its eyes glinting in the moonlight. As I drifted off to sleep, I heard a soft whisper in the stillness. "Play with me." My heart raced. Was I dreaming? I shook off the feeling and turned over. The next morning, I found the doll had moved. It was facing the opposite direction, its head tilted as if watching me. I laughed nervously, thinking it was just my imagination. But then the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Play with me." I decided to ignore it, but sleep became elusive. Every night, I heard those whispers, and the doll seemed to be watching me waiting. One evening, I woke to find the doll perched at the foot of my bed, its expression eerily joyful. "Enough!" I yelled, grabbing it and locking it in a box. The whispers turned into a wail, echoing in my mind. "Help me!" I couldn't take it anymore. I drove to the woods behind my grandmother's house and buried the box deep in the ground, hoping to silence the doll forever. But the next night, the whispers were louder than ever. I realized I couldn't escape it. Weeks later, I woke to a cold wind. The doll was back, sitting on my nightstand, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. I screamed, but no one came. The whispers enveloped me, drowning out my thoughts. "Help me! Play with me!" I couldn't tell where the whispers ended and my thoughts began. All I knew was that I was no longer alone. I became a prisoner in my own mind, haunted by a doll that wouldn't let me go. My friends stopped visiting, and I withdrew from the world, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. Now, as I write this, I see her reflection in the mirror across the room, an eerie smile playing on her porcelain lips. The whispers have become a chorus, a siren song drawing me deeper into darkness. And I know, one day, I will play with her forever. The ticking clock. Every night, the clock in my hallway ticked ominously, each sound echoing through the stillness of my home. I hated the way it seemed to count down my every moment, a constant reminder of time slipping away. After a particularly exhausting day, I decided to finally reset it. To my shock, it had stopped at exactly 3:07 a.m. Frustrated, I twisted the hands to the current time. As I touched them, a sudden chill raced through my arm, as if someone had gripped my wrist. I pulled back, glancing around the darkened hallway. I shook it off, convincing myself I was just tired. That night, I fell asleep easily, but I was jolted awake at exactly 3:07 a.m. The clock began to tick backward, each tick sending waves of dread through me. I tried to rationalize it, but the sound became unbearable. My memories began to fade, my childhood, my friends, all slipping away with each tick. Panic set in as I realized I was forgetting things I had once cherished. I ran to the clock, but as I reached for it, the room warped around me. The air thickened, and suddenly, I was not in my hallway anymore. I was standing in a dark void, the clock still ticking backward, counting down my existence. I could see flashes of my life, my graduation, birthdays, and the faces of my loved ones, all fading like distant stars. The clock struck 3:07 once more, and I felt a pull as if time itself was dragging me under. Desperately, I shouted, "Stop, please!" But the clock only ticked louder, drowning out my voice. In one last moment of clarity, I understood. This was not just a clock, it was a gateway. It was claiming me, pulling me into a timeless abyss. And as the clock continued to tick, I realized I was becoming a mere memory, lost in the echoes of time. The last bus home. It was a late night when I missed the last train home. A bus pulled up, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife. The driver, an older man with hollow eyes and a crooked smile, beckoned me aboard. I hesitated but stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, and the air felt thick and stale. As we drove down the empty streets, the silence was palpable, broken only by the occasional rustling of the passengers. I glanced around and saw their faces, pale, almost ghostly, as if they had been drained of life. I felt a cold shiver creep down my spine, but the driver's comforting voice soothed my nerves. "Don't worry, you're safe with me," he said, turning to meet my gaze. The bus rolled through unfamiliar neighborhoods, and the scenery outside blurred into darkness. I could hear murmurs, low and conspiratorial, among the other passengers. They seemed to be speaking in hushed tones, glancing at me with hollow expressions. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread, but my instincts screamed at me to leave. Suddenly, the bus came to a stop. The driver turned, his smile now twisted. "This is your stop," he said, but I didn't see anything familiar. I felt a pull to get off, but something held me back. I glanced at the door, and it locked with an ominous click. The whispers grew louder, echoing around me. "You shouldn't have gotten on," one passenger hissed, their eyes wide with fear. I looked at the driver, but he just grinned, his teeth sharp and menacing. Panic surged through me, and I stood up, ready to bolt for the door. But as I reached for the handle, the bus began to shake, the lights flickered, and a dark shadow loomed outside the windows, a figure with glowing eyes watching me. The passengers shrieked, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, paralyzing me with fear. "Welcome to the last ride," the driver whispered, his voice now a chilling growl. In that moment, I understood. The bus was never going to let me go. It was a vessel for lost souls, and I had become its next passenger. The world outside faded into darkness, and I realized I was trapped, destined to wander in this nightmare for eternity. The cabin in the woods. When I was invited to spend a weekend at my friend's family cabin, I jumped at the chance. Nestled deep in the woods, it promised peace and adventure away from the chaos of city life. We arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting eerie shadows among the trees. The air was thick with anticipation. That first night, we gathered around the fire, swapping ghost stories. As the flames flickered, my friend's cousin, Sarah, shared a tale about a spirit that haunted the woods, a girl who had gone missing decades ago. They said her cries could still be heard at night, especially when the moon was full. I laughed it off, trying to keep the mood light. But as the night wore on, a sense of unease settled in my gut. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Later, while the others were asleep, I stepped outside to clear my head. The woods were silent, too silent, as if the trees were holding their breath. I wandered a little farther than I intended, drawn by a faint sound like soft sobbing. My heart raced as I followed it, the darkness swallowing me whole. I stumbled upon a clearing bathed in moonlight. In the center stood an old well, its stones crumbling. The sobbing grew louder, echoing around me. "Help me, please." My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I felt compelled to look closer. Leaning over the edge, I peered into the darkness. "Who's there?" I called. Silence. Then the voice came again, more desperate. "Help me. I'm trapped." Just then, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Sarah. "Where are you? Come back." Panic surged. I turned to run, but a cold hand grabbed my ankle. I fell, my heart pounding. "Stay with me," the voice cried, now frantic. I scrambled to my feet, pulling away from the edge. I ran back toward the cabin, the sobbing fading behind me. Breathless, I burst through the door. My friends were asleep, unaware of what had just happened. I tried to shake off the terror, convincing myself it was just a figment of my imagination. But the next morning, Sarah seemed different. She was pale, her eyes hollow. "Did you hear her?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't want to admit that I had. As we packed up to leave, I noticed something glinting in the dirt near the well, a silver locket. It was engraved with a name, Eliza. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had heard the girl's name whispered in the night. We left the cabin, but as we drove away, I glanced back at the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, her face a mask of sorrow. And as we rounded the bend, I heard it, a faint, desperate cry cawing in the distance. The voice in the walls. I moved into an old apartment in the heart of the city, charmed by its vintage style and low rent. The first few days were peaceful, but then I began to hear it, a soft whispering, barely audible at first. I brushed it off as my imagination, but the sounds grew louder, more distinct. At night, as I lay in bed, I could make out phrases, almost like a conversation happening within the walls. I pressed my ear against the plaster, straining to listen. Help me. Can't escape. A chill ran down my spine. I decided to investigate. I spent my weekends digging through the building's history, discovering that a woman had lived there decades ago. She had vanished under mysterious circumstances, and the case was never solved. Determined to uncover the truth, I started to record the whispers, hoping to find clues in the eerie sounds. Night after night, I listened intently. I heard her cries for help, growing more desperate. I began to feel an unsettling connection to her, as if she were reaching out from beyond the grave. One night, as the whispers peaked, I noticed the walls trembling. I felt a strong urge to find a way to help her. I grabbed a flashlight and started exploring the apartment, searching for any hidden spaces or clues. I stumbled upon a loose panel in a closet. My heart raced as I pried it open, revealing a narrow passage. I crawled inside, the darkness enveloping me. The whispers turned to frantic screams, urging me to go further. The passage twisted and turned, and I soon found myself in a hidden room, dust-covered and long forgotten. In the corner lay a small trunk. I opened it, and inside was a collection of letters, confessions of betrayal and fear. The woman had been trapped by someone she trusted, and her cries for help were her last desperate attempt to escape. Suddenly, the room felt colder. I turned to leave, but the passage behind me had closed off. Panic surged as I realized I was trapped. The whispers intensified, swirling around me. "Help me!" echoed in my ears. In that moment of terror, I understood. I had awakened something, and it wouldn't let me go. The walls shuddered, and I could feel her presence surrounding me, her sorrow mingling with my fear. I screamed for help, but the darkness swallowed my voice. And just like that, I became a part of the whispers, forever lost in the walls. The last photograph. While cleaning out my late grandmother's attic, I stumbled upon a dusty old camera. It was an antique, with intricate designs etched into the leather. Curious, I took it down and discovered a stack of old photographs inside, each one showing my grandmother in various places, at the beach, in the garden, and even in front of the old family home. But as I'd flipped through the stack, I found one that sent chills down my spine. It was a photo of her standing in the attic, holding the very camera I had in my hands. But there was something wrong about it. Her expression was eerily vacant, and a shadow loomed behind her, barely visible but undeniably present. I felt compelled to use the camera. I took a few pictures around the attic, the flash illuminating the dusty corners. Each time the shutter clicked, a cold breeze swept through, as if the air itself was alive. I brushed it off as a draft and continued snapping photos. Later that night, I developed the pictures in my makeshift darkroom. The first few turned out fine, but when I reached the last photo, the one taken in the attic, my heart dropped. The shadow behind my grandmother was clearer now, taking the form of a tall, dark figure with hollow eyes. It seemed to be reaching toward her. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that washed over me. I decided to return to the attic, clutching the photo tightly. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel something watching me. I set the camera down, trying to rationalize my fears. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a flicker of darkness darting behind the boxes. I turned, heart racing, but there was nothing there. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. I felt a presence, heavy and oppressive. I grabbed the camera, desperate to capture whatever was haunting me. "Show yourself," I shouted, but only silence answered. With trembling hands, I took another photograph, hoping to catch a glimpse of the shadow. When the flash went off, I saw it, much clearer now, towering behind me. Its mouth twisted into a grin, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I fled the attic, racing down the stairs, but the shadow seemed to follow me, lingering just out of sight. I locked the attic door and hid the camera away, thinking I could forget what had happened. But that night, I heard whispers, low and menacing, filling the dark corners of my room. "You can't escape," they taunted. The next day, I tried to throw away the camera, but it vanished. Each night, the shadows grew bolder, creeping closer until I could feel their cold breath on my skin. The Night Watcher. I moved into a new apartment on the top floor of an old building, drawn in by the view of the city skyline. The first few nights were peaceful, but soon I began to feel a strange presence in a room, an unsettling feeling that I was being watched. One night, I awoke suddenly, a cold sweat coating my skin. My eyes darted around the room, and that's when I saw it, a dark figure standing in the corner, partially obscured by shadows. My heart raced, and I could barely breathe. I blinked, and it was gone. The next night, I stayed up late, determined to confront whatever haunted me. I set up a camera to capture any evidence, convinced I was just imagining things. As I reviewed the footage the next day, I gasped. The figure appeared again, clearer this time, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes staring right at the camera. Panic surged through me. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer, but I had already signed a lease. Each night, the figure returned, creeping closer to the camera, and I could hear faint whispers, a chilling, low sound that sent shivers down my spine. Desperate for answers, I researched the building's history. I discovered that a man had died in my apartment years ago, his life cut short under mysterious circumstances. They said he had watched from the shadows, waiting for someone to join him. That night, I decided to confront the figure. I set up candles around the room, hoping to create a protective barrier. I called out to him, demanding to know what he wanted. The temperature dropped, and I felt a cold breath against my neck. "Join me," a voice whispered, echoing through the darkness. I realized I was in over my head. The following morning, I packed my things, but as I turned to leave, I saw my reflection in the mirror, except it wasn't just my face staring back. The figure stood behind me, grinning, eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. I fled the apartment, vowing never to return. But even now, I can feel him watching me, lurking in the shadows of my mind, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. I can't escape the night watcher. The graveyard shift. I took a job as a night security guard at a local cemetery, drawn by the quiet solitude it offered. My first night was uneventful, just the sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. But as midnight approached, the atmosphere shifted, heavy with an unseen presence. Around 2 a.m., I noticed movement near one of the older tombstones. I squinted into the darkness and saw a figure, a woman in a long white dress, her hair cascading like a veil. She knelt by a grave, her head bowed as if in prayer. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer, but as I approached, she vanished into thin air. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light. But soon after, I heard soft weeping coming from the same spot. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The weeping stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. I felt a chill creep down my spine, and I turned to walk back to my post. But then I heard a voice, soft, sorrowful. "Help me." I froze. It was coming from the same grave. Against my better judgment, I returned to the spot. The moonlight illuminated the headstone, revealing the name. Eliza Hawthorne, who had died over a century ago. I felt a compulsion to kneel, as if something deep within me recognized her sorrow. "What do you need?" I whispered. "Find my locket," the voice echoed, filling my mind. "It holds my spirit." Determined to help her, I began searching the area, feeling a strange energy guiding me. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up, I spotted something glinting among the roots of an old tree, an ornate locket covered in dirt. As I picked it up, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. I felt a rush of cold air, and suddenly, Eliza's ghost appeared before me, her face twisted in anguish. "You found it. Now free me." Terrified, I held the locket tightly, unsure of what to do. "How?" "Open it," she pleaded. With shaking hands, I opened the locket. Inside was a picture of a man and a note that read, "Love endures even in death." As I read the words aloud, the ground beneath me trembled, and Eliza let out a wail that pierced the night. "No," she cried, her form flickering like a dying flame. "You must bury it with me." In a panic, I dropped the locket back into the grave and covered it with dirt. As I finished, Eliza's face softened. "Thank you," she whispered, fading away into the moonlight. The cemetery fell silent, the weight of the night lifting. But as I turned to leave, I felt a tugging at my heart. The locket was still inside my pocket, warm against my skin. I ran from the cemetery, the echoes of her cries haunting me. I may have freed her, but I was now bound to her spirit, forever carrying her love and her sorrow with me. The whispers of the forgotten. As a historian, I was often drawn to abandoned places, hoping to uncover lost stories. When I heard about an old asylum on the outskirts of town, I couldn't resist the temptation. The place had been shut down for decades, rumored to be haunted by the souls of those who had suffered within its walls. I entered through a broken window, my flashlight illuminating the dusty corridors. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and shadows danced in the corners. As I explored, I began to hear faint whispers echoing through the hallways. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the words grew clearer. Help us. Find us. My heart raced as I followed the voices, navigating the labyrinth of rooms. I found remnants of the asylum, old medical equipment, faded photographs of patients, and journals filled with desperate scribblings. The deeper I went, the more intense the whispers became, urging me forward. In one room, I discovered a small group of photographs pinned to the wall. They showed the patients, all wearing expressions of despair. One photograph caught my eye, an empty chair beside a bed with the name Maggie written on it. The whispers grew louder, and I felt a chill wash over me. Help us, Maggie. I realized they were calling for her. I searched the room for anything that could lead me to her story. That's when I found it, a journal hidden beneath the bed. Flipping through the pages, I uncovered Maggie's life. A tale of neglect, despair, and loss. The last entry sent shivers down my spine. They won't let me leave. I hear them whispering. They want me to stay. Suddenly, the whispers turned into frantic screams. Help us! Help us! The walls seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the spirits pressing in, their anguish palpable. In a panic, I grabbed the journal and ran back down the hall. The shadows twisted around me, and I felt hands grasping at my clothes. Stay with us. They cried, their voices filled with desperation. I burst through the front door and collapsed outside, gasping for breath. The whispers faded, but as I looked back at the asylum, I felt a strange connection. I realized I couldn't leave Maggie and the others behind. They needed someone to tell their story. Determined to help them, I returned to the asylum the next day, armed with a recorder to capture the whispers. I vowed to share their story with the world. As I entered the building again, I felt their presence, guiding me deeper into their forgotten home. But I had awakened something dark. Now, every time I close my eyes, I hear their cries, whispers that have bound me to the asylum, urging me to help them escape the shadows of their torment. The echoes of the past. I inherited my grandfather's old house after his passing. It was a ramshackle place, filled with dusty furniture and shadows that danced in the corners. Despite its dilapidated state, I felt drawn to it, hoping to uncover family secrets hidden within its walls. As I settled in, strange things began to happen. At night, I'd hear soft echoes, laughter, whispers, and the faint sound of a piano playing somewhere in the house. The noise would fade as I approached, leaving me in eerie silence. One evening, I followed the sounds down to the basement, where I found an old, broken piano covered in dust. The moment I touched it, a chill ran through me, and the music started again, a haunting melody that resonated with memories long forgotten. Compelled to play, I pressed the keys, and the air filled with a bittersweet tune. With each note, visions flooded my mind, my grandfather as a young man, hosting lively parties with friends and family, laughter echoing through the halls. But then the scenes turned darker. I saw him arguing with a woman, her face obscured by shadows. The laughter turned to screams, and the music warped into a dissonant cacophony. I jolted back, heart racing. The memories felt too real, and I needed to know more. I dug through old photo albums, uncovering images of family gatherings, all centered around the piano. But there was always one woman missing, my grandmother, who had disappeared mysteriously long ago. Desperate for answers, I returned to the basement, ready to confront whatever lingered. I played the melody again, and the air grew heavy. The whispers returned, louder now. Find her, she's here. Suddenly, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, and the shadows deepened. A figure materialized by the piano, a woman, her features blurred but her eyes piercing. You found me, she whispered, her voice echoing through my mind. Who are you? I asked, trembling. Your grandmother. I'm trapped here, tied to the pain of this place. In that moment, I understood. The music had called her spirit back, awakening the echoes of the past. I had to free her. I gathered my courage and asked, "How?" "Play for me," she urged, her voice a haunting lullaby. The haunted music box. At a flea market, I stumbled upon an intricately designed music box, its surface adorned with delicate carvings. Something about it drew me in, so I bought it, eager to learn its secrets. As soon as I got home, I wound it up, and a haunting melody filled the air. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard whispers emanating from the box. They were soft at first, but grew more insistent. "Play me. Play for us." Curiosity piqued, I rose and approached the box. As I opened it, the melody shifted, becoming a sorrowful tune that tugged at my heart. Suddenly, shadows began to flicker around me, swirling in the dim light. I felt a presence, cold and heavy. "We are lost. Help us find peace," a voice murmured from the darkness. I stumbled back, terror gripping me. Determined to uncover the truth, I researched the music box's origin. I learned it had belonged to a family that lived in the house decades ago. The parents had died tragically, leaving their children to wander, searching for solace. That night, I decided to confront the spirits. I set up a small table with candles and the music box, hoping to communicate. As I wound it up, the whispers grew louder, wrapping around me like a chilling embrace. "Help us, we're trapped." I took a deep breath and asked, "What do you need?" "Find our resting place, release us." The melody swelled, and I could see shadows taking form, children reaching out for help. I realized they were asking me to find their graves. Panic surged, but I couldn't turn back. I needed to help them. The next day, I spent hours searching old records, eventually locating the children's graves in a nearby cemetery. I hurried there, the music box clutched tightly in my hands. As I arrived, the atmosphere shifted. I could feel the presence of the children, their energy guiding me. I knelt by the graves, placing the music box on the ground. "Rest now," I whispered, my voice steady. "You are free." As I opened the box for one last time, the music played, filling the air with warmth. The shadows enveloped me, and I felt their gratitude wash over me. The darkness began to dissipate, and I could see the children smiling, their forms growing lighter. In that moment, they vanished into the light, and I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The music box fell silent, but I knew they had finally found their resting place. The darkened path. Every evening, I took the same route home, walking through a narrow path that wound through a dense forest. I loved the solitude, the way the trees whispered secrets to one another. But one evening, as I walked, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the path in an eerie mist. I hesitated but pressed on, feeling a strange pull guiding me forward. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and I could hear distant whispers calling my name. "Come, follow." An uneasy feeling crept over me, but I was entranced. The path twisted, leading me to a clearing I had never seen before. In the center stood an ancient stone well, covered in moss and vines. The whispers grew louder, echoing around me. "Look inside, you must see." Compelled by curiosity, I approached the well and peered into its depths. At first, I saw only darkness, but then images began to flicker, faces twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. I stumbled back, fear coursing through my veins. I turned to leave, but the fog thickened, blocking my way. Panic surged as the whispers intensified. "Stay, be one of us." I felt cold fingers brush against my back, and I spun around, heart racing. Shadows writhed in the fog, their forms barely visible but undeniably sinister. "Join us," they hissed, their voices a cacophony of despair. Desperate, I tried to push through the fog, but it clung to me like a shroud. I could feel the pull of the well, its darkness threatening to swallow me whole. I remembered tales of the forest, the spirits of those who had been lost, luring unsuspecting travelers to their doom. With every ounce of strength, I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers turned into wails, following me as I stumbled down the path. The trees seemed to close in, branches clawing at me, trying to drag me back. Finally, I burst through the fog, emerging onto familiar ground. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, the whispers fading into the distance. I glanced back at the woods, the fog rolling in once more, and felt a sense of dread settle in my gut. I knew that the darkened path would always be there, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to lead astray. And as I walked home, I could still hear the whispers lingering in my mind, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the trees. The reflection. When I moved into my new apartment, I was captivated by the antique mirror hanging in the hallway. It had an ornate frame, and despite its age, it looked flawless. I hung it up, thinking it would add character to my space. That night, I caught a glimpse of my reflection as I passed by. Something felt off, but I shrugged it off. Over the next few days, however, I began to notice that my reflection sometimes lingered longer than I did, as if it were waiting for me to turn around. One evening, I stood in front of the mirror, applying makeup. As I focused on my reflection, I noticed a shadowy figure creeping behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but the hallway was empty. My pulse quickened, and I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, its eyes dark and hollow, a wicked smile curling on its lips. "Who are you?" I whispered, fear clenching my throat. The figure only grinned wider, and as I stepped back, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I hurried away, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, I struggled to sleep, tossing and turning as the image of the figure haunted me. In the early hours, I was jolted awake by a whisper, "Let me in." The voice was low and menacing, echoing in the darkness. I glanced toward the mirror, and there it was, the figure, now fully formed, its hand pressed against the glass as if trying to break through. "Let me in," it repeated, its voice a chilling rust. Panic surged through me. I dashed to the door, but as I reached for the handle, I felt a cold breath against my neck. I turned back to the mirror, and my reflection was gone. In its place stood the figure, stepping out from the glass, its eyes burning with malevolence. "Now it's your turn," it hissed. In a burst of adrenaline, I ran from the apartment, not stopping until I reached the street. I never looked back, leaving everything behind. I later learned that the mirror had belonged to a woman who had vanished mysteriously, her spirit forever trapped, waiting for someone to take her place. The forgotten doll. While cleaning out my late aunt's attic, I discovered a dusty old doll tucked away in a box. Its porcelain face was cracked, and its once beautiful dress was tattered. There was something unsettling about it, but I couldn't resist taking it home. As soon as I placed it on my shelf, strange occurrences began. At night, I heard soft giggles echoing through my room, and the doll would shift slightly, as if repositioning itself. I laughed it off at first, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. One evening, while watching TV, I noticed the doll sitting on the shelf. I could have sworn it was staring at me, its eyes glimmering in the dim light. Shaking off the feeling, I decided to ignore it. But later, I found it in a different spot, sitting on my bed, its tiny hands folded in its lap. "Okay, this is getting weird," I muttered, moving it back to the shelf. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft voice whispering my name. "Play with me." It was sweet and innocent, yet there was an underlying darkness that sent shivers down my spine. "Who are you?" I called out, trying to sound brave. The giggling returned, and suddenly, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room. The doll's eyes seemed to glint with mischief. "You should play with me." Fear clenched my stomach as I remembered the stories my aunt used to tell me about the doll, a toy that had once belonged to a little girl who had died tragically. They said her spirit lingered, seeking companionship. Desperate to rid myself of the doll, I decided to bury it in the backyard. That night, as I dug a hole, I heard the laughter again, louder and more menacing. "You can't get rid of me," the voice taunted. I hurriedly buried the doll and returned inside, locking the door behind me. But as I lay in bed, the giggling echoed in my mind, growing closer. I could feel the presence of the doll lingering, even in its grave. Days passed, and I tried to forget. But every night, I heard the whispers, always beckoning me back. "Play with me. I'm still here." The cursed letter. I found an old letter hidden in a dusty book at a second-hand store. The paper was yellowed and frayed, the handwriting elegant yet shaky. It detailed a woman's descent into madness, filled with paranoia and fear of a presence that haunted her home. Intrigued, I took the letter home, determined to learn more about its author. That night, as I read through the letter, I felt an uneasy sensation creeping over me. The woman wrote about hearing whispers in the walls, strange shadows lurking in her periphery, and the constant feeling of being watched. As I finished reading, I noticed something peculiar. The last line of the letter simply read, I can feel it coming for me. If you find this, beware." Chills ran down my spine, but I couldn't shake my curiosity. I decided to investigate the woman's story further. I spent days digging through old records and discovered that she had lived in a nearby house where she had met a tragic end. The cause of her madness remained a mystery, but many in the town believed she had been cursed. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the letter was somehow connected to me. I tossed and turned, finally falling into a restless sleep. In my dreams, I saw her, her face twisted in fear, eyes wide with terror. "It's coming for you," she whispered. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart racing. The air felt heavy, and a sense of dread settled in my gut. I looked around my room, but everything seemed normal. I brushed it off as a nightmare, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few days, I began to hear whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs echoing through my home. I felt shadows creeping along the walls, always just out of sight. I realized I was becoming paranoid, just like the woman in the letter. One evening, as I prepared for bed, I heard a loud thud coming from the living room. I cautiously approached, my heart pounding. The letter lay on the floor, opened to a page I hadn't seen before. "You have invited it in. Now it will never leave." Panic surged through me. I rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, the shadows thickening around me. I felt a cold presence creeping closer, and the woman's voice echoed in my mind. "You must break the curse, before it's too late." In a last-ditch effort, I grabbed the letter and ran to the backyard, digging a hole beneath a tree. I buried it deep, hoping to sever whatever connection I had unwittingly forged. As I covered it, the air felt lighter, and the whispers faded. But as I lay in bed that night, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the curse still lingering, the whispers echoing faintly in my mind, a reminder of the darkness I had invited into my life. The wishing well. When I moved to a small town, I heard whispers about an old wishing well at the edge of the woods. The locals warned that it was cursed, but I was curious. One evening, driven by a mix of skepticism and intrigue, I decided to visit. The well was overgrown with weeds, its stones crumbling. I peered into the dark depths, and a chill ran down my spine. I tossed a coin in, half-heartedly wishing for good luck. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint voice echoing from within the well. "Help me." I paused, my heart racing. "Is someone there?" I called, but only silence answered. Dismissing it as my imagination, I walked away. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. I found objects misplaced, shadows flitting across my vision, and an overwhelming sense of unease. Then, I started having vivid dreams of a girl, her face obscured, trapped in darkness, pleading for help. Driven by guilt, I returned to the well, determined to uncover its secrets. I called out, "What do you want?" "Help me escape," the voice replied, now clearer, more desperate. That night, I dreamt of the girl again. She looked more frantic, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm trapped here because of your wish," she cried. "You have to set me free." The next day, I visited the town library, searching for any history related to the well. I discovered that it had belonged to a young girl who had disappeared decades ago. Locals believed she had been trapped in the well after someone had tossed a coin, inadvertently binding her spirit. Panic washed over me. I had to do something. I returned to the well, heart pounding. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb you." "Bring me a flower," the voice urged. "A pure flower to break the curse." I spent the next day searching the woods for the right flower, finally finding a rare white bloom. That evening, I returned to the well, the flower clutched tightly in my hand. As I dropped it into the depths, the air grew thick with tension. The girl's voice rose, pleading, "Thank you. Now you must listen." Suddenly, a cold wind whipped around me, and shadows surged from the well, swirling like a storm. I felt a powerful force pulling me toward it. The forgotten room. While renovating my old house, I stumbled upon a hidden door in the basement. It was small and covered in dust, and curiosity compelled me to open it. Inside was a tiny room, filled with cobwebs and darkness. An old rocking chair sat in the corner, and on the floor was a worn-out diary. I picked it up, flipping through the pages. The entry spoke of a girl named Emily who had lived in the house long ago. She wrote about her loneliness and fear, mentioning strange noises and shadows lurking in the corners. The last entry chilled me to the bone. I can feel it watching me. I don't think I can escape. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I heard creaking sounds coming from the hidden room, as if something were moving within. I dismissed it as old house noises, but sleep eluded me. The next day, I found myself drawn back to the room. I opened the diary again and noticed a strange, faded drawing on the last page. A figure with dark eyes watching Emily from the shadows. Suddenly, the temperature dropped and I felt a cold breath on my neck. Panic surged through me as I turned to find the rocking chair slowly moving back and forth. "Help me," a soft voice whispered, echoing from the darkness. I stumbled back, fear gripping me. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice shaking. "Emily," the voice replied, sorrowful and haunting. "I'm trapped here. You must help me." Determined to uncover the truth, I began researching Emily's story. I discovered she had vanished without a trace, and the house had been abandoned for years after her disappearance. The townspeople whispered that her spirit lingered, seeking someone to set her free. That night, I decided to confront whatever haunted the room. I gathered candles and placed them around the rocking chair. "I'm here to help you, Emily," I called out. The air grew heavy and shadows gathered in the corners. "You must find the key," the voice urged, a hint of desperation in its tone. "What key?" I asked, my heart racing. "The key to my freedom." Driven by urgency, I searched the house, checking every drawer and crevice until I found an old rusted key hidden in a box in the attic. I raced back to the hidden room, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I entered, the air crackled with energy. I approached the rocking chair and held up the key. "Is this it?" "Yes," the voice whispered, now stronger, more insistent. "Unlock the past." I knelt by a small chest in the corner, finding a rusty lock. With trembling hands, I inserted the key and turned it. The lid creaked open, revealing a pile of old letters and a small locket. As I picked up the locket, a warm light enveloped the room and the shadows receded. "Thank you," Emily's voice echoed, filled with relief. "I can finally rest." The air turned calm, and I felt her presence fade. I left the hidden room, knowing I had freed her spirit. But even now, I sometimes hear a faint whisper in the dark, a reminder of the girl who had once been trapped. The lantern in the woods. Every summer, my friends and I camped in the woods behind our neighborhood. One night, as we gathered around the fire, an old man approached us, his face weathered and serious. He warned us not to wander too far, especially near the old lantern tree. "Strange things happen near that tree," he said, eyes filled with a mix of fear and concern. "They say the lantern lights up at night, and those who follow it never return." We laughed it off as an old wives' tale, but curiosity gnawed at me. Later that night, after my friends had fallen asleep, I decided to explore. Armed with only a flashlight, I made my way deeper into the woods, the trees whispering above me. After walking for what felt like hours, I spotted a faint glow in the distance. My heart raced as I approached, and I realized it was a lantern hanging from a low branch of an enormous tree. It flickered like a beacon, illuminating the surrounding darkness. "Hello," I called out, but the only response was the rustling of leaves. Drawn in by its light, I stepped closer. The air grew colder and the glow intensified. "What's going on?" I wondered aloud. As I reached out to touch the lantern, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman in a flowing white dress, her face obscured by long hair. "You followed the light," she whispered, her voice melodic yet chilling. "You shouldn't have come." I stumbled back, fear gripping my heart. "Who are you?" I gasped. "I'm lost, and now you are too," she said, a sad smile playing on her lips. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted, and I felt an icy grip on my ankle. Shadows surged around me, dark tendrils reaching out from the trees. "No," I shouted, trying to pull away. "Stay with me," the woman coaxed, her voice echoing in my mind. "We can be together forever." Desperate, I tore my gaze from her and ran, the lantern flickering behind me. The woods twisted and turned, branches clawing at my clothes, but I didn't look back. The whispers grew louder, urging me to return. Finally, I burst through the tree line, gasping for breath. I stumbled back to my friends, who were still sleeping peacefully. I collapsed by the fire, shaking and covered in sweat. The next morning, I recounted my story, but they dismissed it as a dream. I never spoke of the woman again, but every night since, I feel her presence watching from the darkness, waiting for me to return to the woods where the lantern glows. The watcher in the attic. After inheriting my grandmother's old house, I was excited to explore every nook and cranny. It was a creaky, charming place, filled with memories of family gatherings. However, the attic had always been off limits, a place shrouded in mystery. One evening, I decided to venture up there, curiosity overpowering caution. The stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. Boxes were piled high, filled with forgotten trinkets. In the corner, I spotted an old trunk, its lock rusted shut. I pried it open, and inside, I found an array of photographs, letters, and a small, intricately carved wooden figure. As I examined the figure, I felt a chill sweep through the attic. Suddenly, I became aware of a pair of eyes watching me. I looked up and froze. There, just beyond the shadows, stood a figure cloaked in darkness, its face obscured. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm the watcher," it replied, its voice hollow and echoing. "You shouldn't have come here." Fear gripped me, and I backed away, but the figure stepped forward, moving with an unnatural grace. "You're not alone here. I've been waiting." Heart pounding, I turned to flee, but as I dashed for the stairs, the attic door slammed shut, trapping me inside. I could hear whispers swirling around me, echoing with despair. "Help us! Help us!" Desperate, I remembered the letters in the trunk. I grabbed them, rifling through the pages until I found one that mentioned a family curse, an unfinished business that tied souls to the house. "The Watcher will guide you," I read aloud, hope flickering within me. "You must complete the task." As I finished reading, the figure appeared beside me, its form now less threatening, almost pleading. "Help me finish what I started," it said, the darkness receding slightly. "Free us." With a newfound determination, I asked, "What do I need to do?" "Uncover the truth," it whispered, pointing to the trunk. "Find what was lost." I spent the night digging through the belongings, piecing together my family's history. With each discovery, the figure grew more defined, revealing a sad face, my great-uncle, a man who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Finally, I found a letter addressed to him, detailing a secret family treasure. As I read it aloud, a surge of energy filled the room. The figure smiled softly, and the whispers began to fade. "Thank you," it said, its voice barely audible. "I'm free." The uninvited guest. It was supposed to be a cozy weekend getaway with friends at a cabin in the woods. The first night was filled with laughter and storytelling around the fire. But as darkness settled, I felt a creeping unease that I couldn't explain. As we prepared to sleep, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, its shape obscured by shadows. I brushed it off as my imagination, but a nagging feeling settled in my stomach. That night, I woke to a strange noise, a soft tapping at the window. I sat up, heart racing, and looked outside. The figure was closer now, illuminated by the moonlight. It appeared to be a woman in a tattered white dress, her face obscured by tangled hair. "Let me in," she whispered, her voice haunting and desperate. I shook my head, too terrified to respond. Instead, I woke my friends, but when they looked outside, the woman was gone. They laughed, dismissing it as a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next day, we hiked through the woods, but I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her again. That evening, as we sat around the fire, the atmosphere grew heavy and the temperature dropped. Then I heard it again, the soft tapping, now accompanied by a low, mournful wail. "Let me in." My friends' laughter faded as they sensed my fear. "Are you okay?" one of them asked. "I saw her last night," I exclaimed. "The woman in white." They exchanged glances but didn't believe me. I was determined to confront whatever was haunting me. I suggested we investigate the area near the tree line. Reluctantly, they agreed. As we approached the trees, the air felt charged, thick with tension. We searched but found nothing. Just as we turned to leave, I heard the whisper again, clear and urgent. "Help me." I felt drawn to a clearing nearby. In the center stood a weathered gravestone, half buried in the earth. It bore the name of the woman, a local legend who had disappeared years ago. Before I could say anything, my friends began to back away, sensing the malevolence in the air. The whispers grew louder, swirling around us. "Help me! Let me in!" Panic surged through me. I turned to my friends, shouting, "We have to leave!" As we sprinted back to the cabin, I could feel her presence pursuing us, shadows closing in. We locked the door and huddled together, the sound of tapping echoing against the walls. Through the night, the whispers turned into screams, piercing the silence. You can't escape. Finally, dawn broke and the sounds faded. We cautiously emerged from the cabin, the morning light casting a warm glow over the woods. But the air still felt heavy, the feeling of being watched lingering. As we packed to leave, I caught a glimpse of a figure in the trees. The woman stood there, her face clearer now, eyes filled with longing and sorrow. I understood then she was trapped, and I had unwittingly become part of her story. The Ghost Rider. I was an aspiring author, struggling to find inspiration for my first novel. One day, I stumbled upon an old typewriter at a flea market. It was beautiful, with intricate engravings and a charm that beckoned me to take it home. I thought it would help spark my creativity. That night, I set the typewriter up on my desk and began to write. As my fingers danced over the keys, words flowed effortlessly. It was as if someone else were guiding my hand, filling the page with hauntingly beautiful prose. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself drawn deeper into the writing process. I would often lose track of time, writing late into the night. But as I wrote, I began to notice strange occurrences. A flickering light, the faint sound of whispering behind me, and shadows shifting in my peripheral vision. One night, I typed a line that chilled me to the bone. The darkness watches, waiting for its moment to strike. Just as I finished, the typewriter paused, and the keys began to move on their own, typing words I hadn't written. "Help me! I am trapped." I froze, staring at the page as the words continued to appear, filled with despair and urgency. "Who are you?" I asked aloud, my voice trembling. "I am the Ghost Rider," it typed, "and I need your help to escape." Panicking, I tried to push the typewriter away, but it felt as though it were anchored to the desk. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. "Complete my story," it replied, the keys clattering violently. "Only then can I be free." Torn between fear and curiosity, I asked, "How do I complete your story?" "Write the truth," it typed, the letters flowing faster than I could read. "The truth of my death." That night, I researched the history of the typewriter and its previous owner, a writer who had mysteriously vanished. As I pieced together the story, the words flowed from my fingertips, his struggles, his fears, and the darkness that consumed him. The portrait in the hallway. When I moved into my new home, I noticed a large, ornate portrait hanging in the hallway. It depicted a woman in a beautiful gown, her eyes striking and full of life. I was immediately drawn to her, but there was something unsettling about her gaze. As the days passed, I felt increasingly uneasy whenever I walked past the painting. It seemed as though her eyes followed me, filled with an intensity that made my skin crawl. At night, I started having vivid dreams of the woman, her face twisting into a look of despair. One night, I awoke to the sound of soft weeping echoing through the hallway. Heart pounding, I stepped out of bed and followed the sound. As I approached the portrait, I gasped. Her expression had changed. The sorrow in her eyes was now palpable, and tears streamed down her painted cheeks. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible but chilling. I stumbled back, terrified. "What do you want?" I asked, feeling ridiculous talking to a painting. "Free me," she pleaded. "Find the truth behind my sorrow." Determined to uncover the mystery, I researched the history of the house and discovered that the woman had once lived there. Her name was Eliza, and she had vanished without a trace after her fiancé was accused of a crime he didn't commit. That night, I returned to the hallway, staring into her eyes. "I'll help you," I promised. "I'll find out what happened." As I delved deeper, I uncovered letters that revealed the truth. Eliza had been framed by someone close to her, and in her despair, she had taken her own life. The more I uncovered, the more the atmosphere in the house shifted, as if Eliza's spirit was awakening. One stormy night, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the hallway. I turned to find the portrait illuminated, her figure almost shimmering. "Thank you for listening," she whispered, her voice stronger now. "But you must confront the one who wronged me." With a shiver, I realized the culprit was still alive, living just down the street. Gathering my courage, I approached the man, confronting him with the truth. He initially denied everything, but as I pressed him, guilt washed over his face. I could see the weight of his past bearing down on him. The next day, I returned home to find the portrait changed again. This time, a serene smile graced Eliza's face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice now filled with peace. "I am free." The house felt lighter, and I knew that Eliza had finally found her rest. Yet as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had merely scratched the surface of the darkness that lingered in the shadows. The lullaby. Every night, I played a lullaby on my old piano to help me sleep. It was a simple melody, but it always brought me comfort. One night, as I played, I noticed a strange chill in the air, but I shrugged it off and continued. As I finished, I heard a soft voice humming the melody. I froze, looking around my dark living room. "Hello?" I called out, but no one answered. Thinking it was just my imagination, I turned off the lights and went to bed. The next night, I decided to play again. As I reached the end of the lullaby, the humming returned, clearer this time. It was a child's voice, sweet yet haunting. Play it again. I felt a mixture of fear and intrigue. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Just a friend," the voice replied, the room growing colder. I love the lullaby. The following nights were filled with the same eerie ritual. I would play, and the voice would hum along, growing more insistent each time. "Play for me, please." One evening, I was exhausted and forgot to play. That night, I was jolted awake by a soft, pleading whisper. "Why didn't you play?" "I can't sleep without it." Terrified, I turned on the light and saw a small figure sitting at the foot of my bed. A girl, no more than 7, with hollow eyes and a sad smile. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, heart racing. "I'm your friend," she replied, her voice echoing as if coming from a distance. "I need the lullaby." Panicking, I jumped out of bed and fled to the living room, but she followed, floating just above the ground. "You promised." I sat at the piano, trembling, and began to play the lullaby. As the melody filled the room, I saw her face soften, the sadness fading. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice growing fainter. But as I played, I realized that I was losing her. "Wait, who are you?" I shouted, but she only smiled sadly. "I'm just lost. I need to find my way home." Desperate, I continued playing, tears streaming down my face. The room felt heavy, filled with sorrow. Finally, as I reached the end of the lullaby, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you. Now I can sleep." In that moment, she vanished, leaving behind a profound silence. The air grew warm, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I had helped her find rest, but as I lay in bed that night, the final broadcast. I worked as a late-night radio host, sharing stories and music with my listeners. It was a small station, but I loved the intimacy of the night shift. One evening, as I prepared for my show, I received a strange package, a vintage radio with a note that read, "Tune in for the truth." Intrigued, I set it up in the studio, adjusting the dials until it crackled to life. But instead of music, I heard a distorted voice filled with static. "Help me! Help me!" Chills ran down my spine. I thought it was a prank, but the voice continued, growing more desperate. "I'm trapped. Please help me." Ignoring my better judgment, I began broadcasting the voice. "If you're out there, call in and share your story." The lines lit up with callers, but none of them seemed to hear the haunting play. As I continued my show, the voice grew stronger, clearer. It told the chilling tale of a woman who had been murdered, her spirit lingering in the airwaves, searching for someone to reveal the truth about her death. "Find me," the voice urged. "I need you to expose the one who did this to me." I became obsessed with the story, researching the woman's life and the circumstances of her death. The more I uncovered, the more the voice echoed in my mind, guiding me. But as I delved deeper, I felt an oppressive weight in the studio, as if the air were thick with sorrow. One night, as I prepared to go on air, the lights flickered, and I felt a cold presence beside me. "You're getting closer," the voice whispered, now sounding desperate. I broadcasted a special segment, revealing the details I had uncovered. As I spoke, I felt the room tremble. "You must name the murderer," the voice pleaded. Heart racing, I revealed the name. A man who had escaped justice, someone who had been close to the victim. The moment I said it, the lights went out, plunging the studio into darkness. A deafening silence filled the air, and I felt a rush of wind. "Thank you," the voice said, now filled with gratitude. "Now I can finally rest." As the lights flickered back on, I found myself alone in the studio. The radio sat silent, the haunting voice gone. I knew I had helped her find peace, but as I left that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the airwaves still held many secrets, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. The cursed doll. When I was a child, my grandmother gifted me a porcelain doll that had been passed down through generations. It was exquisite, with delicate features and a pristine white dress, but there was something unsettling about its gaze. I named her Annabelle, after the old story my grandmother told about how the doll brought misfortune to those who owned it. Despite the warnings, I kept Annabelle on my shelf, a constant reminder of my family's history. However, strange things began to happen. My toys would be rearranged, and I often felt a cold breeze sweep through my room at night. I dismissed it as my imagination, but then came the dreams. Each night, I dreamt of the doll whispering to me, her porcelain lips moving silently as I tried to listen. One night, she clearly said, "Help me escape." Panicking, I woke up drenched in sweat. I had to get rid of the doll. I wrapped Annabelle in a blanket and shoved her into the back of my closet, determined to forget about her. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences intensified. Shadows danced in the corners of my room, and whispers filled the air. One evening, while cleaning out my closet, I found Annabelle lying on the floor, the blanket discarded. I froze, a sense of dread washing over me. "How did you get out?" I whispered. "Play with me," she murmured, her eyes glinting in the dim light. The next day, I took her to the local antique shop, hoping to rid myself of the cursed object. The shopkeeper's eyes widened when he saw her. "You should not have that doll," he said. "It carries a dark history. Get rid of it for me." I urged, panic rising in my chest. He agreed but warned me not to take it back. Relieved, I went home, only to find Annabelle sitting on my bed when I returned. "You can't escape me," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. That night, I locked my bedroom door, but sleep eluded me. I could hear her soft giggles and whispers, creeping closer and closer. Desperate, I decided to perform a cleansing ritual, lighting candles and reciting prayers to break the curse. As I chanted, the room grew colder, and Annabelle's face twisted in anger. "You think you can get rid of me?" she hissed, her voice sharp like glass. With trembling hands, I lit the final candle and shouted, "Leave me alone." In an instant, the doll flew across the room, shattering against the wall. A deafening silence followed, and I felt a weight lift from my chest. I had broken the curse, at least, that's what I thought. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me from the shadows, waiting for her chance to return. The forgotten graveyard. While exploring a nearby forest, I stumbled upon a hidden path that led to an overgrown graveyard. The stones were weathered and covered in moss, barely legible names etched into the surface. I felt an eerie chill wash over me as I wandered among the graves, drawn to a particularly large tombstone at the back. It was engraved with the name Samuel Blackwood, a name that sent a shiver down my spine. As I read the inscription, I noticed the ground beneath it looked disturbed. My curiosity got the better of me, and I began to dig, using my hands to claw away the dirt. After a few minutes, I uncovered a small wooden box. Heart racing, I pried it open and found a collection of strange trinkets and an old journal. The entries were frantic, detailing Samuel's descent into madness as he believed he was being haunted by a spirit that demanded revenge. That night, as I read through the journal, a feeling of dread settled over me. The last entry warned of a curse that would befall anyone who disturbed his grave. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just a story. But then strange things began to happen. I heard whispers in the dark, and shadows seemed to linger just out of sight. One night, I awoke to find the journal open on my nightstand, the pages flipping wildly. "Return what is mine," the whispers echoed. Panic set in. I grabbed the box and rushed back to the graveyard, my heart pounding. As I approached Samuel's grave, I felt an icy wind whip around me, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Return what is mine," a voice screamed, resonating from the shadows. With trembling hands, I placed the box back on the ground, but the whispers did not cease. I backed away, fear clawing at my throat. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb you." Suddenly, the ground shook and I fell to my knees. The shadows coalesced into a dark figure, its eyes glowing with rage. "You have awakened me," it roared, and I felt a chill grip my heart. Desperate, I begged for forgiveness. "Please, I just wanted to know your story." In that moment, the figure paused, and I could see a flicker of sadness in its eyes. "Find my peace, and I shall find mine." Gathering my courage, I promised to tell Samuel's story, to make sure no one else disturbed his resting place. The figure slowly faded, and the whispers quieted. As I left the graveyard, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, but I knew I would never forget the darkness that lingered in those woods, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon its secrets. The reflection. I'd always believed mirrors held a special magic. They could capture moments, reflect beauty, and sometimes reveal the truth. When I found an antique mirror at a thrift store, I was enchanted. It had an ornate frame and a slightly foggy surface that gave it a unique charm. As soon as I hung it in my living room, I noticed something strange. When I looked into the mirror, my reflection seemed slightly delayed, as if it were a heartbeat behind. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, but the unease nagged at me. One evening, as I prepared for bed, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. My reflection smiled back at me, even though I wasn't smiling. I froze, staring in disbelief. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Just waiting," it replied, its tone eerily cheerful. "Waiting for you." I backed away from the mirror, my heart racing. The reflection continued to grin, its eyes sparkling with a sinister glint. "You're so lonely," it said, the words dripping with mock sympathy. "Let me help you." That night, I couldn't sleep, consumed by dread. I kept hearing whispers echoing from the mirror, calling my name. "Join me," it beckoned, the voice seductive and haunting. In a moment of madness, I approached the mirror again. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just to have some fun," it replied, a wicked grin spreading across its face. "You can be free, if only you let me take your place." Panic gripped me. I didn't want to give in, but the allure was strong. "No." I shouted, stepping back, but the reflection laughed, its voice reverberating through the room. "You can't resist forever," it taunted. "You'll come to me." That night, I barricaded the mirror, covering it with blankets and moving furniture in front of it. But the whispers persisted, growing louder. "You'll never escape me." Desperate for help, I researched the mirror and discovered its dark history. It had belonged to a woman who had vanished without a trace. The more I learned, the more I understood that it fed on despair and loneliness. Finally, I decided to confront the reflection once and for all. I removed the coverings and stood before the mirror. "I will not let you take me." I yelled, my voice steady. The reflection snarled, its face twisting in anger. "You think you can fight me?" The reflection. When I moved into my new apartment, I was captivated by the antique mirror hanging in the hallway. It had an ornate frame, and despite its age, it looked flawless. I hung it up, thinking it would add character to my space. That night, I caught a glimpse of my reflection as I passed by. Something felt off, but I shrugged it off. Over the next few days, however, I began to notice that my reflection sometimes lingered longer than I did, as if it were waiting for me to turn around. One evening, I stood in front of the mirror, applying makeup. As I focused on my reflection, I noticed a shadowy figure creeping behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but the hallway was empty. My pulse quickened, and I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, its eyes dark and hollow, a wicked smile curling on its lips. "Who are you?" I whispered, fear clenching my throat. The figure only grinned wider, and as I stepped back, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I hurried away, but the feeling of being watched lingered. That night, I struggled to sleep, tossing and turning as the image of the figure haunted me. In the early hours, I was jolted awake by a whisper, "Let me in." The voice was low and menacing, echoing in the darkness. I glanced toward the mirror, and there it was, the figure, now fully formed, its hand pressed against the glass as if trying to break through. "Let me in," it repeated, its voice a chilling rasp. Panic surged through me. I dashed to the door, but as I reached for the handle, I felt a cold breath against my neck. I turned back to the mirror, and my reflection was gone. In its place stood the figure, stepping out from the glass, its eyes burning with malevolence. "Now it's your turn," it hissed. In a burst of adrenaline, I ran from the apartment, not stopping until I reached the street. I never looked back, leaving everything behind. I later learned that the mirror had belonged to a woman who had vanished mysteriously, her spirit forever trapped, waiting for someone to take her place. The Forgotten Doll. While cleaning out my late aunt's attic, I discovered a dusty old doll tucked away in a box. Its porcelain face was cracked, and its once beautiful dress was tattered. There was something unsettling about it, but I couldn't resist taking it home. As soon as I placed it on my shelf, strange occurrences began. At night, I heard soft giggles echoing through my room, and the doll would shift slightly, as if repositioning itself. I laughed it off at first, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. One evening, while watching TV, I noticed the doll sitting on the shelf. I could have sworn it was staring at me, its eyes glimmering in the dim light. Shaking off the feeling, I decided to ignore it. But later, I found it in a different spot, sitting on my bed, its tiny hands folded in its lap. "Okay, this is getting weird," I muttered, moving it back to the shelf. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft voice whispering my name. "Play with me." It was sweet and innocent, yet there was an underlying darkness that sent shivers down my spine. "Who want you?" I called out, trying to sound brave. The giggling returned, and suddenly, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room. The doll's eyes seemed to glint with mischief. "You should play with me." Fear clenched my stomach as I remembered the stories my aunt used to tell me about the doll, a toy that had once belonged to a little girl who had died tragically. They said her spirit lingered, seeking companionship. Desperate to rid myself of the doll, I decided to bury it in the backyard. That night, as I dug a hole, I heard the laughter again, louder and more menacing. "You can't get rid of me," the voice taunted. I hurriedly buried the doll and returned inside, locking the door behind me. But as I lay in bed, the giggling echoed in my mind, growing closer. I could feel the presence of the doll lingering, even in its grave. Days passed, and I tried to forget. But every night, I heard the whispers, always beckoning me back. "Play with me. I'm still here." The Haunted Music Box. At a flea market, I stumbled upon an intricately designed music box, its surface adorned with delicate carvings. Something about it drew me in, so I bought it, eager to learn its secrets. As soon as I got home, I wound it up, and a haunting melody filled the air. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard whispers emanating from the box. They were soft at first, but grew more insistent. "Play me. Play for us." Curiosity piqued, I rose and approached the box. As I opened it, the melody shifted, becoming a sorrowful tune that tugged at my heart. Suddenly, shadows began to flicker around me, swirling in the dim light. I felt a presence, cold and heavy. "We are lost. Help us find peace," a voice murmured from the darkness. I stumbled back, terror gripping me. Determined to uncover the truth, I researched the music box's origin. I learned it had belonged to a family that lived in the house decades ago. The parents had died tragically, leaving their children to wander, searching for solace. That night, I decided to confront the spirits. I set up a small table with candles and the music box, hoping to communicate. As I wound it up, the whispers grew louder, wrapping around me like a chilling embrace. "Help us, we're trapped." I took a deep breath and asked, "What do you need?" "Find our resting place, release us." The melody swelled, and I could see shadows taking form, children reaching out for help. I realized they were asking me to find their graves. Panic surged, but I couldn't turn back. I needed to help them. The next day, I spent hours searching old records, eventually locating the children's graves in a nearby cemetery. I hurried there, the music box clutched tightly in my hands. As I arrived, the atmosphere shifted. I could feel the presence of the children, their energy guiding me. I knelt by the graves, placing the music box on the ground. "Rest now," I whispered, my voice steady. "You are free." As I opened the box for one last time, the music played, filling the air with warmth. The shadows enveloped me, and I felt their gratitude wash over me. The darkness began to dissipate, and I could see the children smiling, their forms growing lighter. In that moment, they vanished into the light, and I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The music box fell silent, but I knew they had finally found their resting place. The darkened path. Every evening, I took the same route home, walking through a narrow path that wound through a dense forest. I loved the solitude, the way the trees